Today in Real Life Archives. Trapped in the Andes.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a story that is, frankly, going to stay with you long after we're done. We are embarking on a profoundly sobering journey into what is arguably one of the most harrowing survival stories in all of human history. A story set against the unforgiving, isolated, freezing ice of the Andes Mountains. I want to ask you to just quiet your mind for a second and step back in time with me. We're going to the winter of 1972, where a catastrophic twist of fate tested the absolute limits of human endurance, resilience, and the human spirit. Now, this is a story of profound tragedy, yes, but as you'll see, it is also a staggering, almost unbelievable testament to the sheer will to live. For 72 agonizing days, I really want to just let that number sink in for a moment. 72 days. Think about what you've done over the last 2.5 months. Now imagine a group of young men, primarily amateur rugby players from Montevideo, Uruguay, finding themselves utterly and completely isolated from the rest of the world for that exact amount of time. They were stripped of literally every modern comfort. They were thrust into a hostile environment totally devoid of life, and they were forced to confront a reality so unimaginably bleak that how they survived actually challenges our fundamental understanding of human capability. Section 1. Flight 571's fatal route. Okay, let's dive into the technical chain of events that actually led to this catastrophic moment on October 13th, 1972. 45 souls boarded a chartered Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild aircraft. Picture this. Among them were 19 members of the old Christians Club rugby team. They were radiating youth, excitement, and anticipation for a friendly match over in Santiago, Chile. They brought along family members, friends, and they had a crew of 5. After a brief weather delay in Mendoza, Argentina, they finally took off. They were laughing, joking, completely unaware of the invisible, deadly forces that were gathering against them high up in the atmosphere. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't they just fly straight there? Well, the pilots were forced to alter their direct westerly route. Severe weather conditions were absolutely wreaking havoc over the peaks, and this was fueled by the El Niño climate pattern. This phenomenon was actively pushing warm, moist air right into the towering, freezing peaks of the Andes, which caused massive condensation and these incredibly unusually heavy snowstorms. Because their specific aircraft had a maximum altitude ceiling that made flying directly over those highest peaks extremely treacherous in bad weather, they decided to take a longer, U-shaped route south towards the Planchón Pass. To really understand what went wrong, you have to put yourself in a 1972 cockpit. There were no visual GPS screens showing them a little map of where they were. They relied entirely on VOR instruments, which basically means they tracked radio signals from the ground, calculating their speed and time. The co-pilot was navigating by dead reckoning and these radio beacons, but high above those mountains, a massive, unexpected headwind had drastically slowed the plane down. Unaware of their true, much slower ground speed, the co-pilot tragically miscalculated their position. He confidently radioed Santiago, reporting that they had crossed the mountains and were already over Cutico, Chile. But in reality, they were still deep, deep within the treacherous Andean peaks. Believing they had safely cleared the mountains, they began their descent way too early. The aircraft dropped out of the heavy cloud cover, and suddenly a black, jagged ridge rose dead ahead of them. Imagine the absolute terror. The pilots desperately pulled back on the yoke, the plane stalling and shaking violently, the ground collision alarms just blaring in the cockpit. They nearly cleared it, but the tail cone struck a 4,200-meter ridge. The impact instantly sheared off the tail, tragically sucking several passengers out into the freezing void. Then the right wing was torn off, and then the left. The remaining mangled tube of the fuselage plummeted onto a glacier, careening 725 meters down a steep, snow-covered slope at a terrifying speed before ramming violently into a massive snowbank. The seats tore loose, violently crushing the passengers forward. Section 2. The Crash and Aftermath. The Glacier of Tears. When the deafening noise finally stopped and the snow settled, the survivors found themselves stranded at a suffocating altitude of 3,660 meters. To put that into perspective, at that height, the air is incredibly thin. Every single movement exhausts you. 12 people died in the initial crash, or very shortly thereafter, and that included the pilot and the team physician. Many of the others were left suffering from horrific injuries. We're talking all they humanly could to triage the wounded, despite having absolutely zero medical supplies. We really need to understand the physical shock of their new reality. These were young men from a coastal city at sea level. Many of them had literally never even seen snow in their entire lives. And now, as the sun set behind the peaks, night temperatures plummeted to a deadly -30 degrees Celsius. They had no winter clothing, they had no heating, they had no shelter other than the shattered open-ended tube of the fuselage. They huddled together in the pitch black, desperately using ripped nylon seat covers to keep themselves from freezing to death in the total darkness. Days slowly turned into a grueling week. They scoured the sky for planes constantly. They even tried to write a massive SOS in lipstick on the roof of the plane, but they quickly realized the white fuselage was totally invisible against the vast ocean of snow. So the absolute crucial point of despair arrived on the 11th day. A young survivor named Roy Harley had brilliantly rigged a makeshift antenna for a tiny little transistor radio. But through the crackling static, they heard the most devastating broadcast imaginable. The search efforts by the authorities had been officially canceled. They were presumed dead by the world. A survivor named Gustavo Nikolic turned to the group and delivered the heavy news. When someone asked him why that could possibly be good news, he looked at them and replied, "Because it means we're going to get out of here on our own." Section 3, 72 Days of Survival, a fight for existence. It's true what they say, necessity breeds profound ingenuity. With rescue completely off the table, these young men engineered remarkable tools from the broken wreckage around them. Vito Strock devised a genius solar water collector using the aluminum sheet metal from the backs of the seats to melt snow in the freezing sun, which literally saved them from severe dehydration. To battle the blinding, agonizing condition of snow blindness, they crafted improvised sunglasses by cutting up green plastic pilot visors and wiring them to bra straps they found in the scattered luggage. Later on, realizing they would absolutely freeze if they ever tried to hike out, they meticulously sewed a massive communal sleeping bag using copper wire and waterproof insulation stripped directly from the plane's severed tail section. But listen, no amount of invention could solve the agonizing, ever-present reality of starvation. Between the 45 of them, they had originally found only a few chocolate bars, a single tin of almonds, and a little bit of wine. That was it. And at that extreme altitude, the freezing human body aggressively, rapidly consumes its own caloric reserves just to shiver. When all those meager rations were gone, they faced a terrifying threshold. Objectively, the most agonizing decision of their entire ordeal was the solemn, collective pact to resort to survival cannibalism. They agreed openly and explicitly that if anyone died, the others had permission to use their bodies to survive. Using a shard of broken windshield glass, they did the unthinkable. It was a decision that weighed incredibly heavily on them, bringing intense religious and moral trauma, with some of the boys comparing it to the Holy Communion, laying down one's body so that others might live. And just as they somewhat reconciled with this harrowing, impossible reality, nature's cruelty compounded. On day 16, a massive avalanche roared down the mountain in the dead of night, violently smothering the buried fuselage while they slept. It instantly packed the cabin with dense, freezing, heavy snow, claiming 8 more lives in a matter of seconds, including their deeply beloved team captain, Marcelo Perez. The remaining survivors were literally buried alive for 3 agonizing days in a dark, claustrophobic tomb, forced to take turns breathing through a tiny little hole they managed to poke through the roof with a metal pole. Section 4, the impossible 10-day trek. An impossible journey. Weeks bled into months. Infections and starvation claimed even more of their friends. But the tragic loss of their deeply respected friend Numa Turchetti on day 60 became the final, undeniable catalyst for action. His heartbreaking death convinced Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin that waiting at the fuselage meant absolutely certain death. They realized they had to walk out into the abyss or die trying. Parado actually told Canessa a phrase that gives you chills. He said he would rather walk to meet his death than wait for it to come to him. What followed was a trek that honestly defies all physiological logic. This unbelievable 61-kilometer physical feat across jagged, oxygen-starved peaks began. Let's be clear, they had no climbing gear, no ropes, no crampons, no compass. Nando Parado literally wore 3 pairs of jeans layered on top of each other and wrapped his freezing feet in plastic shopping bags to prevent frostbite. For 3 grueling days, these emaciated young men climbed a near vertical ice wall, sinking deep into the snow with every step, huddling inside their makeshift sleeping bag on sheer exposed cliffs as massive blizzards howled around them. On the 3rd day of the climb, Parado finally reached the summit of what he would later name Mount Seller, standing at over 4,500 meters high. Because of the dying co-pilot's confused words on the first day, his absolute expectation was to look over this ridge and finally see the lush green valleys of Chile. Instead, imagine the pure heartbreak. His hopes were absolutely crushed by a terrifying reality. An endless 360-degree expanse of jagged, dead, snow-capped mountains, stretching out as far as the eye could see in every single direction. Realizing the journey would take far, far longer than the few days they had originally planned for, they made a critical, desperate, strategic decision. Vizintin agreed to turn back to the fuselage, actually sliding down the steep mountain on a makeshift sled made from an aircraft seat, just so Parado and Canessa could share his remaining rations and push forward.
For 7 more agonizing days, Parado and an increasingly weakened, fading Canessa descended the western slopes of the Andes. Slowly, almost impossibly, the freezing, blue, dead environment around them began to subtly change. First, they found water actually flowing in a river, instead of just frozen ice. Then, they saw tiny patches of green moss and grass. Then, the rusted remains of an empty soup can, a clear sign of humanity. And finally, on the 9th day of their trek, the greatest sight they could possibly imagine: a herd of cows grazing. The freezing blue nightmare had finally given way to undeniable, beautiful signs of human life. Section 5. The Miracle's Legacy. Exhaustion meets salvation.
Exhaustion finally met salvation. On the rocky banks of a turbulent river in the foothills of Las Maitines, Canessa could barely stand. His body was consuming itself, and he had lost half his body weight. As they were desperately gathering wood, they looked across the rushing, roaring water and saw 3 men on horseback. Now, the desperate communication that saved them was pure ingenuity. The river was way too loud to shout over. So the next morning, one of the men, a Chilean arriero named Sergio Catalan, threw a rock across the river with a pen and a piece of paper tied to it. Parado took it and wrote a desperate, pleading note, tying it back to the rock and throwing it back across. Catalan read the note, understanding immediately the impossible reality in front of him. These emaciated figures were the boys from the missing plane. He threw them a loaf of bread, turned his horse, and rode off to get help. Because of Sergio Catalan's absolutely grueling 10-hour horseback ride to alert the nearest authorities, the Chilean military was immediately mobilized. Helicopters were dispatched straight into the treacherous mountain clouds, actually guided back to the hidden crash site by Nando Parado himself, who refused to be left behind while his friends were still out there. Out of the 45 people who originally boarded Flight 571, 16 emaciated, deeply changed lives were ultimately pulled from the freezing void of that glacier. On December 22nd and 23rd, exactly 2.5 months after they completely vanished from the face of the Earth, the remaining survivors were finally airlifted to safety. The entire world was utterly stunned by their survival, and it quickly became a massive global media sensation. But you have to understand, for the survivors themselves, their legacy was never about the sensationalism of how they stayed alive. It was about a society they built in the snow, a micro-society completely devoid of the cynicism of our normal world, built purely on extreme solidarity, deep love for one another, and the ultimate, unthinkable sacrifice of friends giving themselves so that others might one day return home.
As we wrap up this explainer, we are left to sit in silence with this profound testament to the human spirit. The story of the Andes survivors forces every single one of us to look inward, to look right past our comfortable, everyday lives, and ask a question that haunts and inspires in equal measure. I leave you with this. When stripped of absolutely everything, every comfort, every hope, every certainty, what would you endure, and who would you become to survive?
This is just one story. There are many more you wouldn't believe. Subscribe for the next one.